Tokyo in the 1980s was a city of contradictions. By day, it was a landscape of efficiency, subway trains arriving with mechanical precision, businessmen in gray suits marching through Shinjuku's wide plazas, and shopkeepers bowing politely as they opened their shutters. But when the sun sank beneath the horizon, another Tokyo emerged, a softer, stranger version of itself. Neon lights bled through the haze, their glow turning narrow streets into rivers of color. Pachinko parlors hummed like restless insects, while small jazz bars and smoky izakayas tucked between alleys whispered to those who knew how to listen. It was in this landscape that Jiro Kato built his world. A city so loud with traffic and ambition that only those who spoke softly could truly control it. Tokyo in those years was not only an economic miracle, it was also a city balancing on a tightrope between tradition and modernity. The bubble economy swelled, filling the pockets of bankers, speculators, and opportunists. Skyscrapers pierced the skyline, and fortunes shifted like dice on a gambling table. For most, it was an age of prosperity and restless movement. For a few, it was the perfect backdrop to weave invisible empires. Kato's bookshop sat quietly on a side street in Kanda, the district long known as Tokyo's heart of books. It was not a large store, nor particularly modern. The wooden sign above the door was faded from rain and years of Tokyo's ever-changing air. Inside, the smell of paper and ink lingered, mingling with faint traces of tobacco smoke carried in from the street. Customers wandered in search of philosophy texts, translated poetry, or obscure political essays. Few noticed the man behind the counter, arranging volumes with a librarian's patience. His round glasses reflected the pale yellow light of the shop, and his hands moved with a kind of ritual calm. To most, Jiro Kato was no more than a clerk, a caretaker of other men's words. But Tokyo had always thrived on duality. Just as neon lights revealed new shadows, Jiro Kato lived two lives, one in the open and one carefully hidden. He did not roar his presence, nor stamp his authority. He understood that in a city crowded with noise, the quietest man could command the deepest respect. His empire would not be built with fists or bullets. Instead, it would grow from whispers, from promises exchanged across low tables in tea-houses, from debts recorded not in ledgers but in memory. The 1980s brought opportunity for men like him. The Yakuza were powerful, yes, but also visible. Their tattoos, their rituals, their public displays of strength drew as much attention as fear. Jiro Kato admired their control, but saw their weakness. Too much light made them vulnerable. He had no need for ceremony. He did not want followers who bowed in unison. What he needed was something quieter, something that could slip between the cracks of a city already overflowing with syndicates and corporations. And so, hidden behind rows of hardbound books, he began to deal in information, in favors, and eventually in the kind of quiet money that never passed through the cash register. Tokyo at night gave him cover. When the last customer left and the shop was locked, Kato would step into alleys where silence reigned. Deals were not struck in smoky gambling dens or crowded nightclubs, but in the small pauses of conversation between men who owed him something. Perhaps a rare book located for a professor in need. Perhaps a discreet loan given to a struggling shop owner. Perhaps a whispered piece of information passed along to a man with influence in city government. Each small act was like a volume placed on a shelf, unremarkable alone, but together forming a library of power. The streets outside told their own story. Salarymen stumbled drunk beneath the neon glow, their laughter echoing through alleys lined with vending machines. Young couples walked hand in hand, pausing beneath flickering signs. Taxi drivers smoked cigarettes as they waited for their next fare. Life moved in restless loops, yet within Kato's shop there was always stillness. That stillness was his weapon. In a time when everyone seemed to be shouting to be heard, advertisers, politicians, brokers, bosses, Jiro Kato discovered that silence was the most commanding voice of all. It is easy to imagine him there, in those years. The clerk's white shirt buttoned neatly to the collar, sleeves rolled back just enough to reveal forearms marked not by tattoos, but by the ink of old paper. A pot of tea steaming gently beside the register. His voice low and deliberate, rarely rising above the hum of the city beyond the door. If you entered as a stranger, you would never suspect him of being anything more than a bookseller. And perhaps that was the point. He understood that in a city full of hungry wolves, the sheepdog survived longer than the lion. What made Tokyo unique in the 1980s was not just its prosperity, but its fragility. Behind the polished glass towers and flashing lights lay cracks. People drowning in debt, companies laundering fortunes, politicians searching for discreet ways to secure power. In those cracks, Kato planted seeds. He was patient, methodical, like a gardener who understood that some plants took years to bloom. Every book he sold was honest business. But every quiet conversation behind the counter was something else. A chance to add another root to his growing network. The empire he began to weave was not one of spectacle. There were no parades of black sedans, no chains of nightclubs stamped with his name. Instead, his power was hidden in the margins. If you needed something, an introduction, a favor, a quiet solution, you might find yourself wandering into his bookshop. You might think it chance. But in Tokyo, little happened by chance. This was the city Jiro Kato mastered, a Tokyo of neon and silence, of roaring streets and hushed side alleys. It was a place where a man could appear invisible while building something larger than anyone dared imagine. And as the 1980s unfolded, the humble bookseller's quiet steps would begin to echo until even the loudest parts of Tokyo would feel the presence of a man they barely noticed. For in a city built on stories, Jiro Kato was writing one of his own. Word by word, deal by deal, night by night. Jiro Kato was born into a world that never expected much of him. He was not born into wealth nor into power. His family lived in a modest home outside of central Tokyo, the kind of place where walls carried the faint scent of tatami mats and mornings began with the slow creak of sliding doors. His father worked long hours for a publishing house, often returning home with ink, stained fingers, and tired eyes. His mother, patient and deliberate, kept the household steady. From them, Jiro inherited two things: a respect for words and an appreciation for silence. As a child, he was different from the others. While classmates laughed loudly in playgrounds, Jiro preferred the corners of the library. He lingered over dictionaries and poetry collections, fascinated not only by stories, but by how stories shaped the way people saw the world. He understood early on that words had weight, that a phrase whispered in the right ear could move a man more effectively than any shove. Books, for Jiro, were not simply objects. They were tools, weapons, and sometimes shields. By the time he was a young man, the book trade seemed the most natural path. He began modestly, working behind counters in second-hand shops, dusting shelves, and quietly recommending volumes to customers who often overlooked his presence. Over years, he saved enough to open his own small store in Kanda, the district long celebrated as Tokyo's capital of books. Kanda's streets were lined with shops, each carrying everything from rare first editions to cheap paperbacks, each filled with the smell of ink, glue, and fading paper. To most shopkeepers, running such a store was a simple life. But for Jiro Kato, the shop was more than a business. It was a stage. He kept his store impeccably neat. Each shelf was organized not only by category, but by a subtle logic of his own. Customers often remarked that if they were searching for something, whether a history of the Meiji era, a volume of French existentialism, or a collection of Basho's haiku, Kato's shop seemed to present it to them as though he already knew their needs. He had a way of observing people, the books they touched, the questions they asked, the hesitation in their voices. From these details, he learned who they were. Some would say he read people the way others read novels. Behind the counter, his manner was steady and unassuming. He did not try to sell aggressively. Instead, he listened. When he spoke, it was with carefully chosen words, each one carrying a kind of weight that made customers lean closer, as though he were sharing a secret. He never raised his voice, never hurried, never revealed irritation. To strangers, this made him seem dull, perhaps even invisible. To those who paid attention, it made him magnetic. His store soon became more than a place to buy books. It became a meeting ground. Professors from the university nearby would linger over philosophy shelves. Businessmen stopped in after work, browsing histories or memoirs before returning to their families. Young students came searching for meaning, drawn to shelves filled with Sartre, Nietzsche, and obscure Japanese poets. But Kato noticed something: every person who entered carried more than the book they sought. They carried their burdens, their secrets, their ambitions. And Kato collected those too. He began in small ways. A professor who could not afford an expensive imported text found it waiting at a discount. A shopkeeper who fell behind on payments received an envelope of cash slipped across the counter with no contract. A government clerk, worried about an indiscretion, found Kato's quiet reassurance more useful than any confession booth. These acts did not seem criminal. They seemed kind, even generous. But each one left a thread tied to Kato, and over time, those threads wove themselves into something larger. A network of obligation, of gratitude, of unspoken debt. What made Jiro Kato different from other men who sought influence was his patience. He was not interested in quick returns. A loan could sit unpaid for years because repayment did not always come in money. Sometimes it came in silence. Sometimes it came in loyalty. Sometimes it came in a whispered piece of information that no one else had heard yet. Each debt was a page in a book only Kato could read. Those who knew him never suspected him of building anything beyond his shelves. If asked about him, they might have said, "He's just a bookseller, quiet man, knows his literature." And indeed he was. But beneath that surface, his real work was underway. His life behind the counter was both mask and weapon. He understood that invisibility was the most powerful armor a man could wear in a city where the loudest voices drew the sharpest knives. In those days, the Yakuza ran much of Tokyo's underworld. They operated gambling dens, construction firms, entertainment businesses, and protection rackets. Their presence was visible in black cars, in tattooed men drinking in smoky bars, in the sudden silence that fell when they entered a room. Kato respected their strength, but also saw their weakness. Their visibility made them vulnerable. Police attention, rival gangs, public fear, all were constant threats. Jiro wanted none of that. His empire would have no tattoos, no loud rituals, no loyalty built on blood. Instead, it would have the quiet strength of a library. Shelves upon shelves of lives bound to him, organized, cataloged, and waiting to be opened when the time was right. At night, after the shop closed, he would sit at his desk in the back room, a single lamp illuminating the pages spread before him. Some were books, of course. Others were ledgers, though not in the traditional sense. He never kept clear records of debts or favors. Instead, he wrote in riddles, in fragments of poetry, in lines only he could decipher. Where another man might write, loaned 50,000 yen, Kato would write, a sparrow waits for spring. Where another man might record a name, Kato would write only the title of a book that reminded him of the debtor's character. These coded notes, indecipherable to anyone else, formed the foundation of his growing empire. From the outside, Jiro Kato was the picture of ordinariness. He swept the shop floor in the mornings, brewed tea for customers, and bowed politely at closing time. Yet each of these gestures concealed a deeper purpose. He knew that in a city where ambition shouted from every skyscraper, the man who whispered would always be underestimated, and being underestimated was the greatest advantage of all. By the mid-1980s, his reputation as a bookseller was secure. Customers trusted him, students admired him, and colleagues respected him. But beneath that quiet exterior, another reputation was spreading, not in public, but in whispers. There were those who said that if you had a problem, Jiro Kato could solve it. If you needed something done quietly, he was the man to see. And if you were wise, you would pay attention when he recommended not a book, but a course of action. In the city of neon and noise, Jiro Kato had built something rare, a life of stillness that drew people to him. He did not chase power, yet it came to him. He did not demand loyalty, yet it was offered. And though he still looked like nothing more than a bookseller, the truth was already taking shape. His empire was not yet visible, but it was there, hidden behind shelves of books and the gentle rustle of turning pages. The surface of Jiro Kato's world was made of paper and ink. To the untrained eye, his shop was nothing more than a quiet haven for literature, a place where students searched for philosophy texts and professors browsed through worn translations. But beneath the surface, hidden in the folds of his daily routine, there existed another kind of library. One not filled with words alone, but with numbers. Kato was never a gambler, nor was he greedy. His fascination with money came not from the shine of coins or the crispness of banknotes, but from the order they represented. Numbers told stories just as books did. They revealed patterns, weaknesses, ambitions, and vulnerabilities. Where others saw yen as currency, Kato saw it as language. Every payment, every debt, every discreet transaction was another sentence in a narrative only he could read. He kept no ledgers in the conventional sense. A traditional record of debts would have been too dangerous, too easily discovered. Instead, he devised a system of coded notes scattered like fragments of poetry among his books. A single margin note in a philosophy text might represent an unpaid favor from a banker. A line underlined in red ink in a novel might correspond to a shopkeeper's loan. A folded piece of paper tucked inside a volume of poetry might describe, in metaphor, a politician's indiscretion quietly covered up. To the casual browser, these were nothing more than quirks of a bookseller. To Kato, they were a map of his growing empire. This hidden ledger allowed him to keep control without appearing to keep control. Nothing in his possession could ever be understood by an outsider. Only he could read the language he had created, an invisible network of obligations and debts disguised as annotations in his carefully curated library. The books were his vault, his safety deposit boxes, his contracts. If the police ever searched his shop, they would find only books and scattered notes, nothing more than the eccentric habits of a man obsessed with literature. Numbers flowed through his hands as gently as pages. He began by offering quiet loans to struggling students, professors, or small shop owners. The amounts were modest, just enough to make a difference, never so much as to attract suspicion. Repayment was flexible. Some returned money in cash. Others offered services, introductions, or silence. Kato never pressed. He let obligations breathe, grow, and ripen. A debt unpaid today might become invaluable tomorrow. Word of his quiet generosity began to spread, though always in hushed tones. Those who came to him were not the reckless or the desperate. They were the careful, the ones who could not afford to be seen begging for help elsewhere. A businessman who could not explain his shortfall to his partners. A teacher who needed money discreetly, without his reputation suffering. A clerk with family troubles that required urgent but private solutions. Each came to Jiro Kato not because he was wealthy, but because he was invisible, and invisibility was priceless. Kato understood that real power was not in the money itself, but in the knowledge money created. Every loan revealed something about the person who took it, their desperation, their priorities, their limits. He cataloged these details in his mind, fitting them into the silent library he was building. He knew which businessman was too ambitious for his own good, which professor had secret debts of honor, which official feared exposure more than ruin. His empire was not one of force, but of information, and numbers were the key to unlocking it. By the mid-1980s, Tokyo's economy was swelling beyond reason. Real estate prices soared, banks issued loans recklessly, and businessmen gambled on futures that seemed only to rise. It was a time of greed, of endless possibility. Yet with such excess came fragility. For every man who grew rich overnight, another lived in quiet fear of collapse. Jiro Kato positioned himself not at the center of this frenzy, but just outside it, where he could observe the flow without being swept away. He lent cautiously, always to those whose silence he could trust. In his shop, the flow of customers never betrayed the hidden current. Students still came in search of poetry, scholars still debated translations at the counter, and tourists still marveled at the shelves of rare books. But in the quiet moments, when a trusted client lingered by the counter, or when the shop door closed for the night, another kind of business took place. A folded note exchanged for a discreet nod, a small package tucked into a paper bag alongside a purchased volume. A brief conversation spoken so softly it could have been mistaken for a discussion about literature. To those few allowed into his confidence, Kato explained his philosophy in simple terms. Books and numbers are the same. Each tells a story. Each has its truth. He never admitted to being a criminal, for in his mind he was not one. He was an organizer, a custodian, a man who maintained balance in a city where chaos ruled. If someone fell into debt, he helped them. If someone risked exposure, he shielded them. In return, they gave him what mattered most, their loyalty and their silence. The system grew quietly, almost invisibly. A small network of shopkeepers, professors, clerks, and businessmen began orbiting around Kato's bookstore, each tied to him by unseen strings. He never pulled those strings too hard. He believed in patience. He knew that an empire built on haste would collapse under its own weight. Instead, he let the debts mature like fine wine, waiting for the right moment to uncork them. And yet, even with his growing reach, Kato never changed his outward demeanor. He still swept the floors each morning. He still recommended books with a quiet smile. He still brewed tea and offered it to those who stayed longer than expected. Nothing about him suggested power. Everything about him suggested stability. It was this contradiction, the powerful man who looked powerless, that allowed him to thrive. The hidden ledger was never written in a single book. It was scattered, fragmented, and alive in his mind. Each day, as he arranged books on the shelves, he was also arranging the debts, obligations, and secrets of a dozen lives. Each night, as he sat at his desk with his lamp and his notes, he reread not the words on the pages, but the stories behind them. Numbers became poetry, debts became verses, and the quiet machinery of his empire continued to turn without a sound. In the end, what Kato built was not merely a system of loans or favors. He built a story that only he could read, a narrative written in ink, numbers, and silence. And like any good story, it was patient, unfolding chapter by chapter, waiting for its moment to be told. Every empire, no matter how discreet, must grow roots before it can rise. For Jiro Kato, those roots were not planted in violence or intimidation, but in something far more enduring: favors. In Tokyo's neon-soaked nights of the 1980s, favors were as valuable as currency, sometimes more. They moved quietly, unmarked by ledgers, untracked by banks, and unnoticed by police. A man might forget the exact number of yen he owed, but he would never forget the debt of a favor granted in his darkest hour. Kato understood this better than anyone. He knew that the human need for help, for rescue, for acknowledgement, was the strongest tether of all. Where others saw vulnerability, he saw opportunity. A man asking for help was not weak. He was open, ready to be bound by the invisible string of gratitude. And once tied, that string could be pulled gently whenever the time was right. It began with small acts. A struggling shopkeeper who feared losing his store to a landlord suddenly found his rent covered, though not by a bank. A university student caught cheating on an exam was quietly shielded when Kato spoke with the right professor, reminding him of an old debt. A city clerk who misplaced documents crucial to his career found replacements appear, slipped into his hands by a friend of the bookseller. Each act was done with a calm hand and a quiet smile, never announced, never flaunted, and each left behind something far more valuable than repayment loyalty. In time, the network around Kato began to resemble a spider's web, invisible to most, but strong enough to trap anything that touched it. Those who benefited from his favors began to introduce others, discreetly, cautiously. A shopkeeper whispered to another merchant about the quiet man who could solve problems. A professor hinted to a colleague about the bookseller whose reach extended further than his shelves. Soon men from outside Kanda, outside even Tokyo's inner wards, began to visit the store, not for books, but for the man behind the counter. Kato never turned anyone away outright, but neither did he accept everyone. His empire was not built on desperation alone. He selected carefully, studying each face, each gesture, each hesitation. He asked quiet questions, not about money or power, but about family, about past decisions, about future fears. From these answers, he judged whether a man could be trusted, whether his debt would ripen into something valuable or rot into danger. Those who did not pass his silent examination left the store with nothing more than a polite bow and perhaps a recommended book. They never suspected how close they had come to a world they would never enter. For those who passed, the favors grew larger, and so did the expectations. A businessman might find a crucial permit approved more quickly than expected, thanks to Kato's whispered word in a government office. A minor politician might discover unexpected support in his campaign, quietly orchestrated through networks that never bore Kato's name. And always, the recipients remembered where the help had come from. They knew better than to speak of it openly. Silence was the price, and silence was the promise. The brilliance of Kato's system was its subtlety. There were no contracts, no meetings in smoke-filled rooms, no photographs of men shaking hands. There was only the quiet memory of a debt. And debts, when layered carefully, became power. Power not in the sense of domination, but in the sense of influence, the ability to shift outcomes, to bend decisions, to shape the city's undercurrent without ever stepping into the spotlight. Tokyo, in those years, was a city built on appearances. Corporations flaunted their success with glittering towers. Yakuza clans flaunted their strength with visible rituals. Politicians flaunted their authority with speeches and banners. Kato, meanwhile, cultivated invisibility. His power moved in whispers, invisible but undeniable. By the time others realized the reach of his network, they were already entangled within it. What made Kato different from the syndicates was not only his discretion, but his philosophy. The Yakuza relied on fear. Their strength came from visible intimidation. Kato's strength came from the opposite, trust. Those who worked with him did not fear his wrath. They feared losing his favor. In a city where loyalty was often bought with money or secured with violence, Kato's method was softer, subtler, and perhaps more enduring. His friends were not bound by threats but by gratitude. And gratitude, when carefully tended, lasted a lifetime. Still, no empire grows without challenges. As Kato's network expanded, so too did the risks. Rivals began to notice the quiet influence that seemed to flow through his bookshop. A small time broker whispered to a gangster about the bookseller, who seemed to move money without moving money. A mid-level politician wondered aloud how certain permits always seemed to pass more smoothly for those who visited Kanda. Yet, when inquiries were made, they led nowhere. There were no paper trails, no bank transfers, no contracts. Only books and notes, and a man who looked like nothing more than a quiet clerk. And perhaps that was the genius of it. Kato's network was not visible because it was not constructed like an organization. It was built like a library, each person a volume, each debt a story, each favor a chapter. He was the librarian, arranging, cross-referencing, and recalling details with ease. No one else could see the whole collection. Only Kato knew where every volume belonged, where every story connected. And so, his power grew not in the open, but in the shadows, layer upon layer, until it became something greater than the sum of its parts. At night, when Tokyo buzzed with neon energy and the streets hummed with drunken laughter, Kato would sit in his small back room, reading. Sometimes it was philosophy, sometimes poetry, sometimes history. But often he was not reading the words at all. He was reading the lives they represented. The banker who owed him a discreet favor, the shopkeeper who was in his debt, the politician whose secrets were tucked between pages. His library was alive, and he was its quiet keeper. By the close of the decade, Jiro Kato was no longer simply a bookseller. He was the center of a network invisible to most, yet powerful enough to shape outcomes across Tokyo. He had no title, no crest, no organization to his name. And yet, in whispers, his legend began to take form. They said that in the heart of the city, hidden behind shelves of old books, there was a man who could turn silence into power, who could weave favors into empire. And they were right. To understand Jiro Kato, one could not look only at the books he sold or the debts he collected. To truly grasp the quiet empire he built, one had to enter the mind that shaped it. His thoughts were not those of a gangster in the usual sense. He did not dream of armies of territory, or of riches flaunted in the open. His inspirations came from philosophy and poetry, from the quiet lessons hidden in words that most read and forgot. Kato often said that a man who wished to control others must first learn to control himself. This idea came from his love of Stoic philosophy, which he discovered as a young man. The writings of Seneca and Marcus Aurelius, translated into Japanese, shaped his view of the world. To endure without complaint, to act with patience, to allow others to rush while one remained still. These were not just ideas to him. They were strategies. He believed that in a world of noise, calm was the sharpest blade. But he did not live on Western philosophy alone. His shelves were heavy with Japanese poets and thinkers. Basho, with his simple haiku that spoke of life's fleeting beauty, Dogen. The Zen master who taught that true clarity came from sitting in silence. And obscure Edo-era writers who described the art of hidden influence in courtly life. Kato absorbed these lessons not as abstract teachings, but as practical tools, where others read poetry to admire its beauty. He read it to understand the mechanics of human thought, the way a single image could capture a mind, the way a single line could linger longer than any command. From philosophy, he learned patience. From poetry, he learned subtlety. And from history, he learned strategy. Kato read military treatises not as a soldier but as a scholar. Sun Tzu's art of war was always within reach, but so too were texts on Japan's own military past. The Sengoku warlords, the Tokugawa shoguns, the rise and fall of clans. He studied how battles were won not only by strength but by timing, deception, and restraint. What others saw as stories of the past, he saw as blueprints for the present. In his mind, life was a chessboard, though the pieces were not obvious. A shopkeeper could be as valuable as a knight, a politician as dangerous as a queen, a student as useful as a pawn. What mattered was not the visible strength of the piece, but its position, its potential, and how it could be moved without being seen. Every person who crossed his path, every favor asked, every debt owed. These were moves in a game that only Kato could see clearly. Yet what made his strategy truly powerful was not ambition, but restraint. He never sought to dominate for the sake of domination. He sought balance. In his view, power was not something to be grabbed, but something to be cultivated like a garden. Too much interference would ruin it. Too little care would let it wither. The key was to act only when necessary, to wait for the right season, to prune carefully but let growth appear natural. In conversation, Kato revealed little of this inner world. He spoke in simple sentences, never raising his voice. But those who listened closely noticed something beneath the simplicity, a weight, a precision. When he recommended a book, it was never random. When he offered advice, it was never careless. Each word seemed chosen not only for what it said, but for what it left unsaid. Customers often left his shop with more than they realized, not just a volume of poetry or philosophy, but an idea planted quietly in their minds. To some, Kato seemed almost like a monk disguised as a merchant. He lived simply, with few luxuries. His clothes were plain, his meals modest. He did not drink excessively, did not gamble, did not seek the pleasures that consumed so many men in Tokyo's booming nightlife. Instead, his indulgence was in thought. He collected words as others collected coins, arranging them in his mind, testing their weight, exploring their possibilities. But beneath that contemplative exterior lay a strategist of rare discipline. He knew that philosophy without action was nothing more than daydreaming. So he applied what he read. When a rival shopkeeper tried to undercut him with lower prices, Kato did not retaliate openly. Instead, he waited, observed, and discovered the man's hidden debts. With a quiet word to the right creditor, he ensured that the rival's store struggled while his own flourished. To the public, it looked like simple misfortune. To Kato, it was the patient unfolding of a plan. Poetry, too, found its place in his strategies. Where another man might send threats, Kato sent riddles. Where another might shout, he whispered in metaphors. His coded notes hidden in books were not just concealments. They were acts of poetry themselves. A sparrow waits for spring might mean a payment delayed. The river bends but still flows might mean patience with an ally. To those who could not read his language, these were meaningless phrases. To those bound to him, they were reminders of their place in his story. It was this blending of philosophy, poetry, and strategy that made Kato unique. He did not separate the world of ideas from the world of action. For him, they were one and the same. A man could fight with fists or with blades, but Kato believed the sharpest weapon was the mind. And the mind, once sharpened by thought, could cut silently, leaving no trace of the wound until it was too late. As the 1980s wore on, Tokyo grew louder, richer, and more reckless. Yet in his bookshop, Jiro Kato remained steady, unmoved by the chaos around him. His strategies unfolded slowly, like chapters in a long novel. He had no need to rush. The city itself was his stage, and time was his ally. Those who encountered him often underestimated him, thinking him nothing more than a quiet clerk with a love for books. But in truth, they were stepping into the presence of a man who saw the world as a library, each life a volume, each choice a sentence, each secret a line of poetry waiting to be read. And Jiro Kato was not just reading. He was writing, shaping the narrative of Tokyo itself, page by page, silence by silence. On the surface, Jiro Kato never looked like a man of influence. He was not tall nor imposing. His glasses gave him the air of a schoolteacher, and his soft voice carried no edge. If you passed him on the streets of Kanda, you would not glance twice. He blended into Tokyo as easily as a single lantern in a crowded night market. And yet, this was the very disguise that allowed him to rule more effectively than men who wore their power openly. In the 1980s, power in Tokyo was loud. Yakuza clans flaunted their black sedans, their tailored suits, their sharp tattoos revealed in baths and bars. Politicians made speeches from decorated stages, their words amplified by megaphones. Businessmen filled skyscrapers with ambition, chasing the illusion of endless growth. To survive in such a city, one might think you needed to shout louder, to show your strength more clearly. But Kato believed the opposite. He saw power not as a spectacle, but as a mask. And his chosen mask was that of a humble clerk. The brilliance of the disguise lay in its ordinariness. Who would suspect a man who spent his days shelving philosophy books and brewing tea for customers of orchestrating a web of influence across Tokyo? Police officers never gave his shop a second glance. Rivals underestimated him, dismissing him as irrelevant. Even those within his network sometimes forgot just how much reach the quiet bookseller truly had. That was exactly how Kato preferred it. The less they saw, the more he could move. Inside his shop, he carried himself with the same habits every day. He swept the floors in the morning, unlocked the glass door with precise timing, and arranged the shelves with care. To outsiders, he was simply a man committed to his small trade. But within those repetitive gestures lay a ritual of control. Every movement reinforced the disguise. Every polite bow concealed the strategist's mind working behind his round glasses. His power revealed itself only in the smallest of ways, almost imperceptible unless you knew where to look. A professor would mention Kato's name in passing, and suddenly his project would receive funding. A shopkeeper would whisper gratitude after a debt was mysteriously forgiven. A minor politician, once overlooked, found himself climbing the ranks thanks to unseen support. None of these outcomes carried Kato's signature. None bore his fingerprints, yet they all traced back to him. Unlike the Yakuza, who enforced loyalty with threats, Kato maintained it through trust and consistency. He never raised his hand in violence, never sent men to intimidate. His strength came from something subtler: reliability. If Kato promised help, he delivered. If he asked for silence, it was honored. Over time, this created something rare in the underworld: faith. His allies did not obey out of fear. They obeyed because they believed in him, because his word had never faltered. The disguise of a clerk also allowed him to maneuver freely through Tokyo's layers. He could meet with a banker in the morning, a student in the afternoon, and a politician in the evening, all without raising suspicion. A gangster would draw attention. A businessman would raise questions. But a bookseller was harmless, invisible, trusted. His shop became a neutral ground where men of all kinds could meet without alarm. Those who stepped through the door might leave with a book, or they might leave with a secret. Sometimes they left with both. What made Kato's rule particularly effective was his refusal to claim it openly. He never declared himself a leader, never called his network an organization. There were no meetings, no ranks, no ceremonies. Each person bound to him felt as though they were part of something personal, not institutional. They owed a favor to Kato, not to an abstract family or syndicate. This personal tie created bonds stronger than hierarchy because they were rooted in gratitude and respect. And yet, beneath the humility, Kato was no saint. His patience had limits. Those who broke his trust, those who betrayed his silence, discovered that even a clerk could strike. But when Kato acted against someone, it was never loud, never messy. A rival who grew too curious might find his loans suddenly called in by unseen creditors. A man who spoke too freely might discover his reputation quietly ruined by whispers. A betrayer might vanish from relevance, not because of violence, but because every path around him quietly closed. To outsiders, these downfalls looked like accidents, like misfortunes. To those inside the network, they were reminders Kato's quiet power was not to be taken lightly. This blend of humility and control gave him an almost mythical quality. People spoke of him in hushed tones. Some claimed he could move the city with a word. Others said he knew every secret worth knowing in candor. Still others believed he had no ambition at all, that he simply enjoyed the game of influence the way a reader enjoys a novel. In truth, the myth only strengthened his disguise. The more mysterious he became, the safer he was behind the mask of a bookseller. What separated Kato from other men of influence was his ability to live two lives without conflict. By day, he was genuinely a bookseller, tending his shop with care, recommending volumes with knowledge, speaking kindly to students and scholars. By night, he was the silent architect of a hidden empire, balancing debts, arranging favors, guiding outcomes. He did not see these roles as contradictions. To him, they were two chapters of the same story. The shop was not merely a cover. It was the heart of his strategy, the stage upon which his entire disguise rested. As the bubble economy swelled, more men around Tokyo were ruined by greed, undone by their own arrogance. Kato watched calmly, never rushing, never exposing himself to the same risks. He remained steady, content with his disguise, content to be underestimated. For in a city of bright lights and loud voices, the quietest man often ruled most effectively. Jiro Kato did not need to sit on a throne to be king. He ruled from behind a counter, with a ledger disguised as poetry, with a network disguised as friendships, with power disguised as simplicity. And in that disguise, he found his greatest strength, the ability to control everything while appearing to control nothing at all. For every quiet empire, there are others watching. Tokyo in the 1980s was not a city with one shadow, but many. The neon glow that painted the skyline also illuminated rivalries too delicate to be seen in the open. While Jiro Kato moved carefully, building his influence behind the mask of a clerk, there were others who preferred louder games. And though their paths did not always cross, the city was too small, too crowded for rival shadows to exist without tension. The most obvious rivals were the Yakuza. Their presence was everywhere. Tattooed men smoking in alleys, black sedans parked near pachinko parlors, the occasional outburst of violence that newspapers quietly recorded but rarely explored too deeply. To them, Kato was an oddity. He did not play their game, did not bow to their rituals, did not wear the marks of belonging. And yet, he seemed to move in spaces they thought they controlled. Money flowed toward him. Influence bent in his favor. People who should have been dependent on Yakuza protection instead turned to the quiet bookseller. At first, they ignored him. He was too small to matter, too quiet to threaten. But as the years passed, whispers grew. A banker chose Kato's guidance over theirs. A shopkeeper, who owed debts to a clan, somehow settled them without Yakuza intervention. A politician who once relied on underworld support now seemed to have a subtler patron. These were not direct confrontations, but to men who lived by dominance, even small shifts felt like challenges. Kato understood this perfectly. He knew that the Yakuza thrived on visibility, on being feared, on being seen as unavoidable. His approach was the opposite. So long as he remained in disguise, he could operate beneath their notice. Yet he also knew that if his presence became too large, too undeniable, conflict would be inevitable. And so he practiced what he always did best: restraint. He never sought to compete with the Yakuza on their terms. Instead, he carved out spaces they considered unimportant: students, academics, small traders, minor officials. Places too small for gangsters to care about, but fertile enough for Kato to plant his influence. But the Yakuza were not the only rivals. In the world of finance, Tokyo was alive with opportunists. The bubble economy created men who seemed to rise overnight: speculators, brokers, entrepreneurs who believed the future belonged to them. Many of these men built fortunes quickly, but with little foundation. Kato watched them like a reader watching characters in a novel. He knew which ones would collapse, which ones would rise, and which ones might prove dangerous. Some he quietly supported, turning them into allies who never even realized they were part of his web. Others he allowed to fail, knowing their downfall would strengthen his own position. Among these rivals was a young broker named Masato Arai, whose ambition burned brighter than caution. Arai dismissed Kato at first, seeing him as a harmless bookseller, irrelevant to the serious games of finance. But when a deal slipped through his hands, because one of his partners was quietly steered elsewhere, toward a man connected to Kato, Arai realized the bookseller was more than he seemed. A quiet rivalry began. One fought not with violence, but with influence. Arai tried to expose Kato, to unmask him as something more than a clerk. But each time, the evidence slipped away, the connections dissolved, as though Kato were a shadow impossible to pin down. In the end, Arai burned out quickly, undone by his own recklessness, while Kato remained steady, untouched. The most delicate rivalries, however, were not with gangsters or businessmen, but with other men of silence. Tokyo's bureaucratic world was filled with quiet power brokers. Civil servants, district officials, men who had built their own invisible empires of favors and secrets. They operated not in alleys or boardrooms, but in offices stacked with paperwork and corridors echoing with quiet deals. Some of these men recognized Kato as a kindred spirit, someone who understood that true power wore no uniform. Others saw him as a threat, a wild card who had no official position, no bureaucratic leash. Kato treated these rivals with the greatest caution. He never sought to undermine them directly. Instead, he offered something they valued more than competition: usefulness. If an official needed silence, Kato could provide it. If a bureaucrat needed a favor carried out without attention, Kato's network could deliver. He became less of a rival and more of a tool, until even those who distrusted him found themselves dependent on his quiet efficiency. Still, rivalry in the dark carried risks. Rumors swirled. Some whispered that Kato's reach extended even into the police, though no one could prove it. Others claimed he was backed by an older, hidden clan, though those who searched for such connections always found nothing. These myths only deepened the mystery. In a city where everyone wanted to know who controlled what, Kato remained the one man no one could map fully. That alone made him dangerous. But Kato himself never thought of it as rivalry. To him it was simply balance. He did not seek to destroy others, only to exist alongside them, to find the spaces they overlooked. If they grew suspicious, he stepped back. If they pressed too hard, he disappeared into his disguise. He knew that survival in a city like Tokyo required more than ambition. It required the humility to know when not to be seen. And so, while other powers clashed openly, Yakuza turf wars, corporate collapses, bureaucratic scandals, Kato's empire remained untouched. His rivals rose and fell, shouted and vanished, while he remained behind the counter of his bookstore, offering poetry to a student, philosophy to a professor, silence to a desperate man. In the end, his greatest rivalry was not with any man or clan, but with the city itself. Tokyo demanded noise, speed, excess. Kato offered the opposite, quiet, patience, restraint. And in that contrast lay both the tension and the genius of his story. For while others tried to rule Tokyo by matching its chaos, Jiro Kato ruled by resisting it, by reminding the city that even in a storm of neon and ambition, silence could still be the strongest power of all. There are men who command by shouting, by filling the air with orders, by leaving no room for doubt. And then there was Jiro Kato, who commanded by saying almost nothing at all. His silence was not emptiness, it was presence. In a world where everyone else rushed to speak, his quiet became a weight heavier than words. Kato's silence was not accidental. It was deliberate, a tool as sharp as any blade. When a man entered his bookshop, desperate, sweating with debt, or tangled in trouble, Kato rarely offered immediate advice. He would listen, his head slightly tilted, his round glasses catching the dim light. And then, nothing. He would pour tea. He would turn the pages of a book. He would let the man's words hang in the air, unanswered. The silence pressed down until the man, unable to bear it, spoke again. In that gap, truth slipped out, details the man never intended to reveal, secrets that would not have surfaced under questioning. Kato's silence pulled confessions like gravity. In meetings with his closest allies, the same pattern unfolded. They would argue, propose, even fight among themselves, while Kato sat quietly. At first, his quietness felt like disinterest. But slowly, they realized that he was not absent, he was observing. He measured each tone, each hesitation, each unspoken fear. And when the noise had exhausted itself, when all arguments had been laid bare, he would finally speak a single sentence. Sometimes only a few words. Yet those words carried more weight than the hours of shouting that had come before. His silence had sharpened his speech into something precise, undeniable. Kato understood something simple words lose their value when overused. But silence creates space, and in that space, imagination does the work. Those who dealt with him often left unsure of what he truly thought. And in their uncertainty, they filled the void with their own fears or hopes. This made Kato larger than life. To some, he was a mentor. To others, a hidden threat. To all, he was someone they could never fully read. Even his punishments relied on silence. A man who failed him might not receive threats. Instead, he would receive nothing, no calls, no messages, no visits. Suddenly, The stream of favors dried up. Friends stepped back, opportunities closed, doors that once opened with ease now remained shut. The man would feel the absence like a shadow creeping over his life. Kato did not need to say, "You are finished." The silence said it for him, and it was far more terrifying because it offered no path of resistance. How does one fight what is not spoken? In contrast, his rewards were also silent. A struggling ally might find a debt settled without explanation. A project blocked by red tape might suddenly move forward. A favor might appear at the perfect moment, unannounced, unsigned. The recipient knew it was Kato's doing, though no words confirmed it. Silence made the gift heavier because it demanded reflection. Gratitude grew stronger when it was not asked for, only felt. The most striking example of his silent control came during an evening gathering in the back of his shop. A small group of men, traders, academics, and a local official had gathered to discuss a growing problem with a Yakuza clan pressing into their district. They spoke heatedly, each proposing ways to resist, to bargain, to fight. Kato listened unmoving. Hours passed. The men grew frustrated, demanding his opinion. Finally, he lifted his teacup, sipped slowly, and set it down. Then he spoke. "Do nothing?" The word stunned the room. Do nothing. The clan was pressuring businesses, demanding money. How could inaction be the answer? Yet Kato did not explain. He returned to silence, leaving them unsettled. Weeks later, the clan shifted its focus elsewhere, distracted by rival conflicts in another ward. The pressure dissolved without a fight. Only then did the men understand the wisdom of Kato's silence. He had seen what they could not, the storm passing on its own, the danger of acting too quickly. His refusal to speak had prevented them from making a costly mistake. Silence was also his shield. In a city where the police listened for names, where rivals gathered rumors like weapons, Kato's refusal to speak protected him. He never wrote down incriminating details. He never said more than was needed. Conversations with him were like reading a poem, open to interpretation, filled with suggestion, but never literal. By the time anyone tried to piece together his meaning, the moment had already passed. Even those closest to him sometimes wondered what he truly wanted. Did he crave power? Was he building an empire for himself? Or was he simply playing a game, more interested in the act of influence than its rewards? Kato never said. His silence left space for speculation, and speculation kept others bound to him, because they could never be certain whether they stood inside his trust or outside it. The weight of his silence reached beyond individuals. It shaped the atmosphere of his bookshop. Customers entered speaking loudly, but soon lowered their voices as though the shelves themselves demanded respect. Meetings held there carried a hush, as if noise would break the spell. Even the air seemed heavier, slower in Kato's presence. People found themselves pausing, reconsidering, softening their tone. His silence was contagious, spreading through the room until everyone moved to his rhythm. And yet, Kato was not cold. His silence was not the silence of distance, but of depth. When he listened, he truly listened. When he paused, it was not to punish, but to allow others space to reveal themselves. In a city addicted to speed and sound, his quietness offered something rare: reflection. Many left his shop not only bound to him by debts or favors, but genuinely changed, as though his silence had forced them to confront truths they had long avoided. In this way, Kato's empire was not built with speeches or threats. It was built with pauses, with glances, with the heavy presence of unspoken words. His silence became his identity, his weapon, his shield, his crown. He proved that the loudest man in the room is often the weakest, and the quietest man, if disciplined enough, can rule without ever declaring himself king. Tokyo, in all its chaos, never quite understood this. But those who dealt with Jiro Kato never forgot. Long after the meetings ended, long after the tea grew cold, they carried the weight of his silence with them, like an invisible hand, guiding, reminding, controlling without ever touching. The 1980s in Tokyo had been a fever dream. Land prices soared. Towers of glass and steel reached higher each season, and men who had once counted coins now counted millions. But like all dreams, the bubble had to end. By the early 1990s, the city began to wake, and the awakening was harsh. Fortunes vanished overnight, companies crumbled. Families that had believed themselves untouchable discovered that wealth built on speculation could dissolve like smoke. For Jiro Kato, the collapse was not a surprise. He had seen it coming long before most men dared to admit it. His shelves were not only lined with poetry and philosophy, but with histories of boom and bust, tales of empires that rose too quickly and fell even faster. He understood that nothing grows forever, that every peak carries within it the seed of its decline. While others rushed headlong into the frenzy of easy money, Kato remained steady, as though he could hear the faint cracking of the bubble long before it burst. When the collapse came, it was not chaos to him. It was confirmation. He had prepared not by hoarding wealth, but by building resilience into his network. Where others had tied themselves to the illusion of endless growth, Kato had tied himself to people. He had invested not in skyscrapers, but in trust. And trust, unlike markets, does not collapse overnight. His bookstore, too, became a refuge in those years. Men who once swaggered through Tokyo's nightlife came to him humbled, carrying debt instead of profit, fear instead of ambition. They sought advice, or comfort, or simply silence. Kato gave them all three. He did not gloat over their downfall. He did not offer pity either. Instead, he provided perspective, reminding them that decline was not death, that survival required patience, and that silence often outlasted noise. The collapse, however, was not without danger. Desperate men make reckless choices. Some turned violent, others clung to the Yakuza, hoping muscle could protect what money could not. Kato had to tread carefully. His network, built on favors and subtle influence, risked unraveling if too many of its threads snapped under the weight of the crisis. But once again, his restraint saved him. He did not rush to save everyone. He chose carefully, helping those who would endure, letting others fall away. His empire shrank in numbers, but grew in strength, purified by the fire of the collapse. The Yakuza, too, felt the shock. Their visible wealth, their flashy cars, their extravagant lifestyles, all became harder to sustain. Police pressure increased as the government sought scapegoats for the economic disaster. The clans fought among themselves, splintering, bleeding resources. In this turbulence, Kato's invisibility became his greatest shield. While gangsters clashed in alleys and headlines, the quiet bookseller remained untouched, his empire of whispers unnoticed. Yet the collapse also tested his philosophy. For years he had ruled by patience, by silence, by restraint. But now the city itself was crumbling. Could silence still guide him through? Could patience endure in a time when survival demanded swift action? Kato wrestled with these questions in solitude, pacing the narrow aisles of his shop at night. He knew that a man who clung too tightly to the past would perish with it. To survive, he would need to adapt without betraying the principles that had carried him this far. His solution was subtle, as always. He began to use his shop not just as a meeting place, but as a sanctuary. Students struggling with bleak futures found comfort in philosophy. Traders broken by debt found perspective in poetry. Even minor officials, fearful of losing power, found quiet advice between shelves. Kato became more than a strategist. He became a keeper of calm, a reminder that the storm would pass. By giving others space to breathe, he ensured their loyalty even as the city around them suffocated. And while the economy shrank, stories about Kato only grew. Whispers spread that he had predicted the collapse, that he had guided allies safely through it, that he alone understood the deeper rhythms of Tokyo. None of these stories could be proven, yet their persistence gave him a mythic quality. In a time of ruin, people needed to believe in someone who had seen beyond the chaos. Kato, the silent bookseller, became that figure. Still, not all was secure. Among those ruined by the collapse were men who remembered his silence as indifference, who blamed him for not saving them, who believed he could have done more. Some became enemies, their resentment simmering quietly. A few even sought revenge, whispering his name to the police or to rivals. But Kato's disguise protected him. What evidence could anyone provide? He was a bookseller, nothing more. His enemies destroyed themselves with their noise, while his silence endured. The collapse also offered Kato opportunities. Properties once too expensive now fell into ruin, their owners desperate to sell. Businesses once untouchable now begged for rescue. Kato, without showing his hand, arranged for allies to acquire these pieces at little cost. He did not hold them in his own name. He never did. But through a web of grateful men who owed him more than money. In this way, he grew stronger from the city's weakness, not as a predator, but as a quiet collector of broken fragments. By the mid-1990s, Tokyo was a different city. The neon still glowed, but dimmer. The ambition was still there, but muted. And in this quieter, sobered Tokyo, Jiro Kato's philosophy fit even more perfectly. His silence no longer contrasted with the city, it matched it. Where once he had resisted the frenzy, now he embodied the calm after the storm. The bubble had burst, fortunes had fallen, but the man who had built his empire on patience, restraint and silence remained standing, his bookshop still open, his influence still alive. For while wealth collapses and power shifts, silence, true silence, endures. And Jiro Kato, more than anyone, knew how to wield it. Legends are usually written in blood, in noise, in spectacle. They are carved into memory by battles fought, by empires declared, by names shouted into history. But Jiro Kato left behind no such marks. His story was never told in headlines, never recorded in police files, never written into the annals of gang wars or financial empires. His legacy existed in whispers, in the quiet spaces where men remembered, not what he did, but how he made them feel. By the time Tokyo entered the late 1990s, Kato had become more myth than man. He still lived as he always had, tending to his bookshop, offering tea, recommending volumes of philosophy and poetry. To the casual visitor, he was unchanged. Just another aging shopkeeper among countless others, a man whose quiet routine blended seamlessly into the city. But for those who had once been caught in his orbit, he was something more. He was proof that power could exist without ever being declared, that control could be exercised without lifting a hand or raising a voice. His influence did not vanish with age. If anything, it deepened. Students who had once bought books from him now held positions in universities, companies, even government offices. Shopkeepers he had helped quietly still spoke of him with respect. Minor officials, who had once sought his advice in silence, carried his lessons into their careers. None of them would have admitted they belonged to an organization. Yet all of them, in their own way, carried Kato's mark. A decision delayed, a word chosen carefully, a pause held longer than expected. These were echoes of his silence. moving through the city like invisible threads. But what made Kato's legacy remarkable was not only the reach of his influence, but its style. He never sought to be remembered as a leader, never built monuments, never claimed victories. His power was designed to vanish as soon as it worked. A debt repaid was forgotten. A favor granted was left unnamed. A secret kept was never spoken of again, and so his empire dissolved into the air, leaving behind no structure to be toppled, no dynasty to be dismantled. What remained was not an institution, but a way of thinking, the way of Kato. It was a way built on patience, on listening, on restraint. It taught that silence could carry more weight than speech. That trust could be stronger than fear, and that influence did not need to be visible to be real. Those who had once stood close to him carried these lessons like invisible tattoos. They shaped their lives differently because of him, not always consciously, but undeniably. As the years passed, stories about him grew. Some claimed he had predicted every major turn in Tokyo's turbulent decades. Others whispered that he had connections stretching even into the highest offices of government. A few said he had disappeared entirely, retreating into some mountain temple, leaving the city behind. None of these stories could be proven, and perhaps that was the point. For Kato, mystery was always more powerful than certainty. In being unknowable, he became unforgettable. In truth, he never disappeared. He aged quietly, his hair graying, his steps slowing. The shop remained open, though fewer visitors came as time changed the city. The neon grew harsher, the alleys more crowded with new distractions, the old rhythms replaced by faster ones. Yet Kato endured, like an old poem sitting untouched on a shelf, waiting for the right reader. Did he feel regret? That question, too, was swallowed by silence. He had never chased wealth, so he did not mourn its absence. He had never sought fame, so he did not miss recognition. His joy seemed to remain in the same small gestures, the turning of a page, the steeping of tea, the patient observation of lives unfolding around him. For Kato, the empire he built was never about domination. It was about proof. Proof that a man could live quietly, humbly, invisibly, and still shape the world around him. And so his legacy was not measured in the usual ways. He left behind no skyscrapers, no fortune, no family name engraved in stone. Instead, he left behind stories, fragments carried in the minds of those who had encountered him. A professor remembering the strange calm of his bookstore. A former trader recalling the day Kato's silence stopped him from making a ruinous decision. A politician who owed his rise to an invisible hand. Each of these stories was incomplete, imperfect, unverifiable. But together, they formed a legend stronger than fact. The legend of the bookseller who built a crime empire without violence. The man who ruled Tokyo's shadows not with fists or guns, but with patience and silence, and in that legend lies his true immortality. For long after the man himself faded, long after the bookstore's door was locked for the last time, people still whispered about him. They asked how it was possible for a clerk to hold more power than gangsters. They wondered what secrets he had taken with him into the grave. They debated whether he had been a criminal at all, or simply a philosopher who played with the city as though it were a text to be read and rewritten. The truth, perhaps, no longer mattered. What mattered was the story told and retold, soft enough to soothe, sharp enough to unsettle. The story of Jiro Kato, the bookseller who built an empire of shadows in the neon night of 1980s Tokyo, who proved that silence could rule louder than noise, and who left behind not riches, but a way of seeing the world differently. His life ended quietly, just as it had been lived. No drama, no scandal, no great unmasking. A clerk to the very last, but his legend did not end. In fact, it began precisely at that moment, when he was no longer there to contradict it. The silence he left behind became eternal, echoing through Tokyo's alleys, its libraries, its memories. And so, when one walks through the city at night, past the old districts where neon still flickers against the mist, one might imagine him still there. A thin man with glasses, arranging books, waiting for the next soul to wander in. Not to sell them a story, but to remind them that the greatest stories are the ones written between words, in the pauses, in the silences. The story of Jiro Kato is not a tale of endings. It is a tale of endurance, a tale that whispers. Sometimes the quietest man in the room is the one who never leaves it.